The morning air hung heavy with the scent of pine and damp earth as the hikers set out, their boots crunching on the gravel trail. The forest loomed around them, dense and alive, with the occasional burst of birdsong breaking the silence. A faint mist clung to the ground, swirling around their ankles like a ghostly companion, reluctant to leave. Zoe walked ahead, her camera slung over her shoulder, snapping photos of the early light piercing through the canopy. She was always a step or two in front of the group, her restless curiosity urging her onward. Behind her, Allison adjusted her pack and checked the map. Her geologist instincts had already marked the area as fascinating, a maze of fault lines, steep ridges, and jagged rock formations that spoke of ancient tectonic violence. "This trail's supposed to lead to a killer view," Pete said, his voice tinged with excitement as he wiped sweat from his brow. The youngest and least experienced of the group, Pete had spent most of the trip marveling at the sheer size of everything, the mountains, the trees, even the sky itself. He hadn't quite adjusted to the physical demands of the hike, but his enthusiasm made up for his lack of stamina. Luke brought up the rear, his quiet confidence a steadying presence. A seasoned outdoorsman, he'd taken on the unofficial role of the group's protector. "We've got a couple more miles before we hit the ridge," he said, his voice calm and low. "Pace yourselves." They fell into a rhythm, their breathing syncing with the crunch of boots and the occasional scrape of trekking poles. The trail climbed steadily, winding through the forest until it broke free onto an open slope. The trees gave way to low shrubs and patches of wildflowers that dotted the landscape like splashes of paint. Ahead, the horizon stretched wide and uninterrupted, a breathtaking expanse of green and blue. Zoe stopped abruptly, lowering her camera. "Hey," she called out, pointing toward the distance. "Does the horizon look off to anyone else?" The others followed her gaze. At first, nothing seemed unusual. The line where the sky met the earth was crisp and clear, a perfect boundary that stretched infinitely. But as they stared, a subtle distortion became apparent. The horizon seemed to dip slightly to the left, as if the world itself were tilting ever so slightly. "It's just the terrain," Allison said, adjusting her glasses. "We're on an incline. It's probably playing tricks on your eyes." "No," Marcus interjected, his brow furrowed. "It's not the incline. Look at the trees. They're standing straight, but the horizon's curved. That's not normal." "I don't see it." Pete squinted, his face scrunching in concentration. "You wouldn't," Zoe muttered under her breath, earning a laugh from Carla, who had been quietly observing the exchange. Carla, the fitness junkie of the group, had little patience for Pete's inexperience, but had softened as the trip went on. "Let's keep moving," Luke said, his voice breaking through the growing tension. "It's probably a mirage or something. The ridge isn't far." As they continued, the odd curve of the horizon remained in the back of their minds, a whisper of unease they couldn't shake. Marcus fiddled with his compass, muttering under his breath when the needle wavered erratically. "That's weird," he said, showing it to Allison. "It's not holding steady." "Magnetic interference," she suggested, though her tone betrayed uncertainty. "Maybe there's iron in the rocks around here." "Yeah, maybe," Marcus replied, his voice hollow. He slipped the compass into his pocket, his mind turning over possibilities he didn't want to voice. By the time they reached the ridge, the curve had grown more pronounced. It was no longer a subtle dip, but a noticeable bend, as if the earth itself were folding away from them. Zoe snapped photos, her fingers trembling slightly as she adjusted the focus. Through the lens, the distortion was even more apparent, the horizon warping in ways that made her stomach turn. "This is wrong," she whispered, more to herself than anyone else. Pete tried to lighten the mood, laughing nervously. "Maybe we're just on the edge of the world." "No edge," Marcus said sharply. "The world's a sphere." "This isn't possible." "Well, it's happening," Luke said, his tone clipped. "Arguing about it won't change anything." The group fell silent, the weight of their shared unease settling over them like a shroud. The wind picked up, carrying a faint hum that none of them could place. It wasn't the rustle of leaves or the buzz of insects. It was deeper, resonant, like a sound that came from beneath the earth. They set up camp on a flat patch of ground, their usual chatter subdued. The fire crackled weakly in the encroaching darkness, its light casting long, wavering shadows that seemed to stretch farther than they should. Zoe examined her photos by the firelight, her hands shaking as she flipped through the images. Each one seemed wrong. Trees bent at impossible angles. The sky appeared stretched, as if someone had taken hold of it and pulled. "We should head back tomorrow," Allison said, her voice firm. "Whatever's happening here, it's not natural." "We came to explore," Marcus argued. "And now we've found something worth exploring." "You want to run away from that?" "I want to survive it," she snapped. The hum grew louder as the night deepened, a low vibration that made the ground beneath them feel unstable. Pete lay awake, staring at the tent ceiling, his heart racing as he swore he felt the earth tilt ever so slightly beneath him. By the time sleep claimed them, none of them felt quite right. Something had shifted, and though they couldn't put it into words, they all knew. They were no longer in a place they understood. The morning broke unnaturally. The sun rose too quickly, its light filtering through the trees at sharp, almost geometric angles. Shadows splayed out across the landscape, jagged and exaggerated, as if the forest were trying to claw its way toward the sky. The air felt heavier, dense and stifling, each breath dragging against their lungs. Allison was the first to emerge from her tent. She rubbed her eyes, staring at the horizon with a lingering unease that had taken root overnight. The curve was sharper now, unmistakable. It no longer seemed like an optical illusion. The earth itself appeared to bend, as though the terrain had begun to fold into something incomprehensible. Did anyone else feel like the ground was moving last night? Pete's voice was barely a whisper as he stepped out of his tent, his face pale and drawn. The novice hiker looked even more shaken than the night before. Allison didn't answer immediately. She didn't want to admit it, but she had felt the same. It was subtle, like a faint ripple beneath her sleeping bag. A sensation of the earth subtly shifting, as if something vast and unseen had stirred just below the surface. "Breakfast," Luke said flatly, interrupting the tense silence. He crouched by the fire pit, stirring the embers back to life. His movements were mechanical, his usual calm replaced by an almost robotic efficiency. He was clearly trying to ground himself, but even his practiced hands fumbled with the flint. By the time the group was packed and ready to move, the tension between them was almost tangible. Zoe walked a few paces ahead, her camera hanging loosely at her side. She hadn't taken a single photo all morning. Her fingers hovered over the lens cap, but she hesitated each time, as if capturing this warped reality would make it irrevocably real. The trail ahead was no longer familiar. The terrain twisted subtly, the trees growing at impossible angles, some leaning toward the horizon while others bent backward, their trunks curved like bows. The once solid ground had become inconsistent. Certain patches felt soft and spongy, while others were unnervingly hard, like polished stone. "Stop," Marcus said abruptly, holding up a hand. His voice carried an edge of urgency. The group halted, their eyes darting to where he was pointing. Ahead, the trail folded into itself. The dirt path rose sharply, then dipped, creating an undulating curve that defied logic. It wasn't just the horizon anymore. The ground beneath their feet had begun to follow suit. "What the hell is that?" Carla asked, her voice tight. She had been unusually quiet all morning, her typical confidence eroded by the growing sense of wrongness. "Geological anomaly," Allison muttered, but the words felt hollow even as she said them. Or maybe a landslide. "It's not a landslide," Marcus snapped. "Landslides don't bend gravity." He pointed to a stream that crossed the path ahead. The water flowed uphill, its surface shimmering unnaturally. The sight was enough to make Zoe gag, and she turned away, clutching her stomach. "We need to turn back," Allison said firmly, her voice trembling despite her best efforts to sound authoritative. "This is beyond anything we're equipped to handle." "No," Marcus said, his eyes alight with a manic determination. "We're not turning back. This is incredible. It's some kind of spatial distortion, maybe an unknown tectonic effect. We could be the first to document this." "Document what? Our deaths?" Carla snapped. "Look around, Marcus. Does this feel survivable to you?" Before Marcus could respond, Pete let out a sharp yelp. The group turned to see him sprawled on the ground, his face pale. "I tripped," he stammered, his voice shaking. "But I swear I fell up." "What are you talking about?" Luke growled, hauling Pete to his feet. "I mean, when I fell, I felt like I was falling the wrong way." Pete gestured weakly at the warped path ahead. Like gravity shifted, Luke glanced at the incline ahead, his jaw tightening. He didn't want to admit it, but he could feel it too. Gravity wasn't behaving the way it should. His balance felt off, as though his body was being pulled in conflicting directions. The group pressed on, their movements slow and hesitant. The warped landscape seemed to mock them with every step, its unnatural geometry growing more pronounced. Trees bent into arches that twisted in on themselves, their branches forming spirals that hurt to look at. The air vibrated with an almost imperceptible hum, like the low thrum of a massive engine just out of sight. Zoe stopped suddenly, raising her camera. "There's something ahead," she whispered. The group followed her gaze. At the edge of the warped incline stood a figure, or at least the outline of one. It was humanoid but distorted, its limbs unnaturally long and thin. The figure didn't move, but its presence was undeniable. It stood perfectly still, as though it had been waiting for them. "Is that a person?" Pete asked, his voice barely audible. "It's not," Zoe whispered, lowering her camera. Her hands trembled as she clutched the device to her chest. "It can't be." "Keep moving," Luke ordered, his voice tight. We don't stop. Not here. The group skirted around the figure, their eyes locked on it even as they tried to avoid its gaze. As they passed, the figure seemed to flicker, its edges blurring like static on an old TV. Pete stumbled again, letting out a small cry, but Luke yanked him to his feet without a word. When they finally dared to look back, the figure was gone. By the time they stopped to rest, the group was on edge, their nerves frayed. Marcus paced back and forth, muttering theories under his breath, while Carla sat with her head in her hands, refusing to speak. Zoe stared at the horizon, her eyes wide and unblinking. Pete clung to Luke like a lifeline, his breaths shallow and rapid. The horizon now loomed impossibly large, its curve dominating the landscape. The world around them felt stretched and distorted, as though they were being funneled towards something beyond comprehension. "What's at the end of this?" Allison whispered, her voice breaking. "What happens if we reach it?" No one answered. No one dared. And the morning came, but it brought no relief. The sun climbed into the sky at an angle that felt wrong, casting light that seemed to splay unnaturally over the twisted landscape. Colors appeared muted, the greens of the forest dulled, the blues of the sky faded into an unsettling gray. Shadows stretched impossibly long, as though fleeing the very land beneath them. Allison stood at the edge of the campsite, staring into the distance. The horizon was no longer a mere curve. It had become a sharp incline, a slope that rose into the sky and then dipped into a void. The air seemed thinner, harder to draw in, and her head throbbed with a dull ache. This isn't just a distortion, she thought. The rules of reality are unraveling. Behind her, the group stirred in uneasy silence. No one spoke much anymore. Marcus muttered to himself, his theories becoming increasingly frenzied and incoherent. Zoe clutched her camera, though she hadn't taken a photo since the day before. Carla's usual confidence had been stripped away, leaving her pale and trembling. Pete refused to meet anyone's eyes, his hands gripping the straps of his pack like they were the only thing tethering him to sanity. Only Luke seemed composed, though his jaw was tight and his gaze was distant. "We're not staying here," Luke said finally, his voice firm. "We move forward. There's no going back through that mess." "What if going forward is worse?" Carla whispered. Her voice was thin, her usual sharpness dulled by fear. "Then we deal with it when we get there," he replied. The decision made, they packed up their gear in silence. The trail ahead was no longer a trail. The ground rose in uneven, spiraling ridges that defied logic, forcing them to climb with their hands as much as their feet. Gravity pulled at them in strange ways, tugging them sideways or backward, making every step a struggle. As they climbed, the hum in the air grew louder, resonating in their chests. It wasn't just a sound, it was a presence, a vibration that seemed to pulse through the ground, the air, even their bones. Pete stumbled, crying out as his footing gave way, but Luke caught him before he slid too far. "Focus," Luke growled. "We keep moving." The landscape around them shifted in ways that defied understanding. Trees twisted into spirals that reached skyward, their leaves fluttering unnaturally in a wind no one could feel. Rocks jutted out at impossible angles, some floating a few inches off the ground. Streams of water flowed in fragmented paths, splitting into droplets that hovered in the air before recombining. "We're walking into something we can't comprehend," Allison said, her voice trembling. "This isn't natural. This isn't Earth anymore. It's a higher dimension," Marcus said, his voice shaky but tinged with awe. "The curvature, the distortion, it's not random. It's structured, designed." "Designed by what?" Carla snapped, her fear boiling over into anger. "What kind of goddamn nightmare are we walking into?" No one answered. They reached the top of the incline, and what lay beyond stole the breath from their lungs. The world ended, or at least it seemed to. The ground fell away into a chasm of shifting geometries, a void filled with twisting, shimmering shapes that defied logic. Angles bent into curves, and lines stretched into spirals. It wasn't blackness, but a kaleidoscope of impossible colors, each one searing into their minds like a brand. At the edge of the chasm stood another figure. This one was clearer than the one they had seen before. It was tall and humanoid, but its proportions were wrong. Arms too long, legs bending in ways that made no sense. Its head tilted unnaturally, as though studying them. "It's been leading us here," Zoe whispered, her voice trembling. "It's been pulling us in." The figure didn't move, but the ground beneath their feet began to shift. The incline grew steeper, tilting them toward the void. Pebbles and dirt rolled toward the edge, disappearing into the swirling chaos below. "Back up," Luke barked, but there was nowhere to go. The slope was too steep, and gravity too erratic. Marcus broke first. He stepped toward the edge, his arms outstretched. "It's beautiful," he said, his voice filled with awe. "It's the truth." "Marcus, no," Allison shouted, but it was too late. He stepped into the void, and the others watched in horror as his body warped. His limbs stretched, his face twisted, and his scream became a distorted echo that faded into the abyss. The ground shifted again, and the group scrambled to stay upright. The figure at the edge began to dissolve, its outline bleeding into the chaos beyond. The hum grew deafening, a resonant roar that shook the very air around them. "We have to jump," Allison yelled, her voice barely audible over the noise. "Are you insane?" Carla screamed. "If we stay, we'll fall anyway." Allison grabbed Zoe's arm and pulled her toward the steep slope they had climbed. "The incline. Use it to push off." "It's the only way." One by one they leapt. The warped gravity flung them backward, sending them tumbling down the slope. Rocks and debris scraped their skin, and the world spun around them in a nauseating blur. When they finally came to a stop, they lay in a heap at the base of the incline, gasping for breath. The hum was gone. The twisted geometry, the void, the figure, everything had vanished. The horizon was flat again, the landscape eerily normal, but the group was not the same. Allison sat up, clutching her head. Zoe's camera lay broken nearby, its lens shattered. Carla stared at her trembling hands, silent tears streaming down her face. Pete sat motionless, his eyes unfocused, muttering to himself. Luke was the last to stand. He looked at the horizon, his face grim. "It's not over," he said. Allison followed his gaze. In the distance, barely perceptible, the horizon curved, This time in the opposite direction. The group had escaped the void, but the rules of reality had already begun to unravel. The question now wasn't whether they could return to normal. It was whether normal even existed anymore.